Tonight, something remarkable is hiding in plain sight. For centuries, we've been reading Sun Tzu completely wrong. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you changes everything we thought we knew about power, strategy, and survival itself. Most people see Sun Tzu as a battlefield philosopher, the guy entrepreneurs quote in LinkedIn posts, without actually reading him. He's become a meme, a symbol of strategic thinking, the wisdom behind every corporate power play. But here's what should make everyone pay attention. That version is a complete distortion. Because when you actually read The Art of War, not the excerpts, not the motivational quotes, but the full text, you discover something that will make you rethink everything. Sun Tzu wasn't obsessed with winning battles. He was obsessed with avoiding them entirely. He wasn't interested in glory, discipline, or domination. He was interested in one thing above all else: cost. And in a world bleeding itself dry through endless warfare, Sun Tzu became the first thinker to articulate an uncomfortable truth that still haunts us today. The greatest threat to any nation is not the enemy at your gates, it's the invoice that arrives afterward. Make no mistake. People believe the art of war is about fighting. Tonight, let me tell you what it's really about: finance. Welcome to the Historiq Finance, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever what it appears to be on the surface. If you're watching this wondering how a 2,500-year-old military manual became relevant to modern economics, stay with me. The answer is more urgent than you think. To understand Sun Tzu's financial genius, and here's where it gets interesting, you have to understand the world he inhabited. Because these ideas didn't materialize from philosophical contemplation. They emerged from a civilization collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. China during the late spring and autumn period, and into the Warring States era, we're talking roughly the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, was a landscape of fractured kingdoms, each one convinced it could unify the known world, and each one systematically draining its treasury to attempt it. War was constant. Alliances formed and shattered like glass. Armies expanded every decade, transforming from aristocratic chariot duels into massive infantry mobilizations that demanded food, metal, intricate supply lines, and taxation at a scale no previous generation had ever conceived. This is what we need to understand. States weren't just fighting battles anymore. They were conducting full-scale stress tests of their entire economic systems. Every time a king dispatched an army into the field, he was essentially taking out a loan against his kingdom's future. And here's the hook: far too often, those loans came due before victory ever arrived. Most Western audiences imagine ancient warfare as tactical and heroic, something noble. But in this period, war was logistical before it was anything else. The truth is, the moment an army moved, the financial meter started running. You needed wagons, grain, horses, craftsmen, armorers, cooks, blacksmiths, porters, and every single one of them required payment or provisions. A campaign lasting more than a few months could bankrupt a smaller state. A campaign lasting more than a year could collapse a major power. And because these kingdoms existed in a cycle of perpetual insecurity, they kept fighting anyway, draining themselves in the process. It was an arms race before the modern world invented that term, and it was straining the entire political system to its breaking point. This is the world Sun Tzu walked into not as some philosopher sitting in contemplative silence, but as a strategist forced to solve an economic crisis that everyone else was treating as a military problem. In the West, we've romanticized him as an ancient CEO whisperer, some mystical business guru. But in reality, he was closer to a risk manager. He examined the numbers, calculated the costs, analyzed the timelines, studied the logistics, and arrived at a devastating conclusion. The way states were conducting war was fundamentally unsustainable. Victory meant absolutely nothing if the treasury collapsed. And that should make every viewer lean in, because most rulers never grasped this principle. They believed the enemy's army represented their greatest threat. Sun Tzu believed their own spending was. That's why the most critical line in The Art of War appears at the very beginning, before he ever discusses deception, terrain, or morale. He states, "War is of vital importance to the state. Not glorious, not honorable, not noble. Vital meaning dangerous, fundamentally disruptive, and fully capable of destroying the very society it claims to defend. He dedicates the rest of the book to explaining how to keep war contained, controlled, and as economically cheap as possible. And he does it in a way that reveals his true obsession, minimizing financial exposure at every turn. Let me explain why this matters, because even his most famous ideas turn out to be economic principles wearing military disguise. When he says, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," that's not mysticism or philosophical poetry, that's cost-avoidance strategy. It's the ancient equivalent of achieving the outcome you need without burning capital. When he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he's stating a literal fiscal reality. The longer a campaign extends, the more it systematically erodes the state's capacity to function. And when he emphasizes speed, efficiency, intelligence gathering, and psychological pressure, it's because these instruments are cheaper than deploying armies. Here's what Sun Tzu doesn't want you to miss. He wasn't trying to win battles. He was trying to prevent states from bankrupting themselves while attempting to win battles. To understand how revolutionary this thinking was, and this is where the danger lies, you need to understand what Chinese warfare looked like before Sun Tzu arrived. For centuries, aristocratic elites engaged in ritualized conflicts where honor mattered more than actual outcomes, and economic cost barely entered the strategic discussion. But as populations expanded and weapons technology evolved, warfare scaled up into something completely unrecognizable. States began standardizing coinage, reforming tax systems, and constructing bureaucracies solely to sustain their military forces. Fighting became a national project and an existential financial risk that could destroy everything. Sun Tzu saw that the old mindset had become suicidal. War could no longer be treated as a stage for noble gestures or symbolic victories. It had transformed into a budgetary threat that required cold, unsentimental analysis. This is why Sun Tzu represents such an anomaly in world history. While virtually every other military thinker glorified combat and celebrated battlefield heroics, he treated war as a balance sheet. He calculated supply chains, resource depletion, and opportunity cost centuries before those terms even existed in human language. He had zero patience for generals who chased glory at the expense of stability, because he understood a truth that modern leaders often forget. Every decision made on the battlefield is ultimately a decision about national solvency. And if you miscalculate that equation, you don't just lose soldiers, you lose the entire state. Stay with me, because when you finally examine the art of war through this economic lens, the book stops reading like ancient poetry and starts reading like a financial spreadsheet. Sun Tzu opens his treatise by listing 5 fundamental factors that determine war's outcome, and buried beneath the philosophical language lies a simple truth. These are cost variables. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method, and discipline. These aren't mystical categories drawn from Eastern philosophy. They're resource management categories. He's asking, what does this war require? How stable is your state? How resilient are your people? How efficiently can you mobilize and move? How disciplined is your administration? He's performing a risk assessment long before that concept existed. And from the very first page, Sun Tzu makes crystal clear that leaders who cannot calculate cost have absolutely no business calculating strategy. That's why so much of the book focuses on logistics rather than heroics. And here's what intelligence indicates. Sun Tzu devotes an entire section to the economics of feeding an army, and the logic is brutal in its simplicity. When your army is 20 miles from home, you lose the price of 100 measures of grain. His point is, obvious distance increases cost, and prolonged distance multiplies it exponentially. He explains that transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying troops, that maintaining an army in the field collapses the agricultural labor base, and that wasteful commanders bankrupt their nations while winning meaningless skirmishes. For a military treatise, it's remarkably uninterested in battle and obsessively interested in how much the battle costs. He warns rulers to utilize the enemy's resources whenever possible, not as a tactical convenience, but as a fiscal necessity.
He scolds leaders who prolong campaigns not because they're indecisive, but because they're financially reckless and irresponsible. Sun Tzu understood something that modern states frequently forget. Logistics don't merely support strategy, logistics are strategy itself. His approach to intelligence reveals this same financial logic operating beneath the surface. Today, when governments debate surveillance budgets or intelligence agencies request funding, the discussion gets framed in terms of security, ethics, or national interest. Sun Tzu framed it strictly in terms of cost efficiency.
A single spy, he explains, can prevent an entire army from marching in the wrong direction. A single intercepted message can save a nation millions in wasted resources. He writes that what enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer and achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge. Not courage, not force, not bravery. Foreknowledge is simply the ancient world's terminology for data. Here's the deeper story. Sun Tzu saw information not as an accessory to warfare, but as the cheapest and most effective weapon available to any state. He was the first strategist in recorded history to understand that misallocation of information equals misallocation of capital. Even his emphasis on speed is fundamentally about economics when you break it down. Speed is the essence of war, he writes, and most readers interpret this as a call for aggressive action and rapid violence. But Sun Tzu's real meaning is subtler and more devastating. Speed lowers cost. When he urges commanders to move swiftly where the enemy does not expect you, he's describing a cost-benefit trick using timing and deception to completely avoid the expenses of direct conflict. Every day, an army spends marching, feeding troops, and waiting increases financial exposure. Victory delayed is money burned. Victory achieved through maneuver instead of attrition preserves resources. Sun Tzu's famous preference for flexibility, adaptability, and psychological advantage isn't philosophical flair or Eastern mysticism, it's fiscal discipline disguised as military doctrine. But his deepest financial insight is woven into the structural foundation of the book itself. Every line addresses opportunity cost. Every choice a ruler makes closes the door to a cheaper alternative choice. Sun Tzu doesn't oppose war. He opposes waste. And the ultimate waste, in his worldview, is fighting battles you didn't have to fight in the first place. That's why he praises generals who break resistance without bloodshed, who achieve victory through diplomacy, intimidation, misdirection, or strategic alliances. To Sun Tzu, these aren't secondary strategies or backup plans. They are the primary ones because they conserve the state's limited capital. In one of his most revealing passages, and this should concern everyone watching, he warns that rulers who enjoy warfare for its own sake will bring inevitable ruin upon their kingdoms. Behind the poetic language lies a cold accounting principle. If you treat war like a passion instead of a liability, you will eventually default on your obligations. What makes Sun Tzu's financial genius even clearer is examining how states around him succeeded or collapsed based entirely on whether they listened to his warnings. Some kingdoms poured their accumulated wealth into drawn-out sieges that drained their tax base and left them vulnerable to internal rebellion and collapse. Others applied Sun Tzu's logic, deploying information networks, forming alliances, and executing rapid strikes to avoid the economic spiral of prolonged conflict. The states that recognized war as a financial instrument, something to be wielded sparingly and strategically, survived longer and prospered. The ones that treated war as a test of honor or demonstration of brute strength burned out quickly and disappeared from history. Make no mistake, Sun Tzu was not only right in theory. History proved him right in practice, again and again and again. And this is where the story transforms from ancient analysis into something far more contemporary and urgent. Because the uncomfortable truth, the one that should alarm everyone, is that Sun Tzu's warnings have echoed through every major conflict of the last 2 centuries. Modern governments still make the exact same mistake he tried to prevent 2,500 years ago. They enter wars without calculating the long-term economic strain, and then they watch their budgets systematically fracture and collapse. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, imperial powers in World War I. If you're watching this wondering what these conflicts have in common, here it is. These wars weren't lost because armies were weak or soldiers lacked courage. They were lost because the economic model sustaining them collapsed from within. Sun Tzu would have recognized the pattern instantly. Prolonged warfare erodes the state faster than the enemy ever could. Meanwhile, the tools he championed, intelligence operations, deception, targeted strikes, rapid maneuvering, have become the backbone of modern strategy precisely because they are cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. Economic sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy wars, covert influence operations, strategic deterrence, all of them aim to achieve maximum effect with minimal financial exposure. The world's most powerful states still operate inside Sun Tzu's balance sheet, whether they acknowledge it or not. But the clearest modern example of his influence is in how nations now conceptualize national power itself. Sun Tzu believed that the strength of a state came not from its army alone, but from its economic resilience, its ability to absorb shocks, recover from setbacks, and continue functioning. He wrote in an era when kingdoms crumbled because they overspent on campaigns they couldn't sustain. We live in a world where great powers face the identical dilemma in different clothing: military budgets, debt burdens, resource dependencies, supply chain fragility, and the long-term cost of projecting force globally. Sun Tzu might not recognize the technology, but he would absolutely recognize the mathematics. The deeper lesson, the one that most people completely miss, is that Sun Tzu was teaching rulers how to win wars. He was teaching them how to avoid national bankruptcy. His true genius was understanding that the cost of conflict outlives the conflict itself. States do not fail because they lose battles. States fail because they drain the capital that keeps them coherent, confident, and functional. Victory in Sun Tzu's world is completely irrelevant if the treasury collapses afterward. The best war is the one that doesn't require repairing your economy when it's over. And that's the lens through which the art of war suddenly becomes something entirely different from what we've been taught. It's not a book about boldness or aggression or military dominance. It's a book about restraint. It's not about overpowering opponents. It's about outlasting them economically. Sun Tzu doesn't glorify triumph or celebrate conquest. He glorifies stability. To him, the ruler who preserves resources is wiser than the ruler who conquers cities. The general who wins without fighting is wiser than the general who destroys armies. And the state that knows when not to act is fundamentally stronger than the one that acts out of pride or emotion. Here's what we know for certain. Sun Tzu's philosophy is not the philosophy of a warrior. It is the philosophy of a steward, someone responsible for maintaining the long-term solvency and survival of the nation. Tonight, let's step back and see the full picture. In the end, Sun Tzu's financial genius lies in his refusal to separate economics from power. He understood that the two are inseparable, that war is merely the most expensive policy decision a state can make, and that the ruler who miscalculates its cost signs his own death warrant. His message is simple, unsettling, and eternally relevant. Strength is not measured by how hard you can strike, but by how much you can afford to strike. And history demonstrates that when financial systems collide, it is not the bravest nation that prevails, it is the most economically disciplined. We are in a moment where these lessons matter more than ever. As nations calculate their next moves, as leaders decide where to commit resources, as powers position themselves for future conflicts, Sun Tzu's ghost whispers the same warning he issued 2,500 years ago. The enemy you should fear most is the one draining your treasury while you're not looking. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it'll cost you everything all the same. If this gave you a new perspective on power, strategy, and survival, hit subscribe. History has the answers we need right now, and I'll show you exactly where to look. Stay informed, Stay engaged, stay curious. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and stay tuned for our next video on historic finance.